Greetings all, and welcome to the 34th episode of the VTP, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today, we're going to be taking a close look at probably one of the most fundamental aspects of any Pokemon game that really requires serious combat to win, and seeing how the concept has developed into a tradition that every major game in the Pokemon franchise has had a hand in. Yes, today we are going to be taking a look at the assignment and usage of starter Pokemon, and just what defines this massive staple of the Pokemon franchise.
In order for us to really understand what starter Pokemon are, it is imperative to clearly define the factors that actually make a species qualify for the role in the first place, and that's a far harder task than it might seem on paper. For most players in the main series games, a starter Pokemon is what its name suggests, the very first Pokemon that a trainer will receive in their playthrough in normal circumstances, and there is almost always a choice present in making those decisions on a first Pokemon to bond with. However, the issue that comes from this is that what counts as a starter Pokemon in the games, and what it really means in a realistic context, is a bit of a muddled mire. After all, the rare Pokemon that are often counted under this definition are also rarely what most trainers start out with, so it could almost be said that any Pokemon could be seen as a starter if it is the first one that a trainer can get a hold of. As such, we need to set a few criteria that will not only help to keep the definition of these beasts clear and concise, but also help to set up the analysis of why they have come to earn and be defined by these traits in turn. First of all, starter Pokemon sets normally follow a type pattern of some sort that intrinsically links them together via the elemental type, usually in a triangular fashion to form a trio of possible options. Exceptions can occur here though, leading other factors to support their distinction as starter Pokemon. Secondly, they normally can only be found in specific regions where they are given out as starter Pokemon, and only in very specific environments, though importation is also an option in order to make breeding colonies of them in a given region. Thirdly, by normal definition, starter Pokemon in the main series games and most spin-offs are extremely friendly and easy for young trainers to bond with, much more so than other types of wild Pokemon. And fourthly and lastly, starter Pokemon need to be available to beginning trainers via officials, like Pokemon professors, that have the legal authority to distribute these rare Pokemon to said trainers.
Probably the most fundamental aspect of how we define a starter Pokemon is the way that their type assignments initially compare to others in a group, as they usually are found in trios that trainers can pick one from.
The classic trio always seems to involve the use of the grass, fire, and water types as the main primary types, even if they in their evolutions have secondary types, but the question is why those three types? After all, most of the early Pokemon that trainers are likely to encounter are more of common types like the normal, flying, and bug types, so why these three types specifically? In my opinion, I think that these three types work the best for starter Pokemon groups because they not only form a simple and easy to understand triangle of type advantages and disadvantages, fire burns grass, grass absorbs water, water douses fire, but also because these types stand out from the other common types as mentioned before, and thus can help to make the Pokemon themselves feel more special to a beginning trainer. They're not something they could easily just find outside, and thus have more gravitas and help to teach trainers to take good care of their Pokemon right out of the gate, as they are unlikely to find others as unique as them just wandering about in the wild.
Now, this might not always be the whole truth, as in some cases where a trio is not really an option, other unique types and species can be substituted in.
As an example, in emergency situations, the regional professor of the Kanto region, Professor Oak, has been known to offer Pokemon like Eevee and Pikachu as starters if the normal trio is not available. This is because Eevee are incredibly rare in the wild and can evolve into a number of different types, thus giving them an edge in terms of versatility over other species, whereas Pikachu fall into the former category of having a specialty type that is rare for younger trainers to see in the wild after just starting their journey. Aside from this though, the standard elemental triangle works well for this in giving novice trainers lessons in type effectiveness, something that is key if they want to grow as trainers and become adept at using their Pokemon in battle.
Alongside being used as living teaching tools for young trainers, starter Pokemon also tend to be isolated to specific locations in the regions where they are given to trainers, and it is very rare for them to cross geographic and/or regional boundaries in this manner.
This sort of limited exclusivity helps to make starter Pokemon unique because it limits the way in which trainers can actually acquire them, and thus helps to guard local populations from waning if they somehow make it to another region. If a rare starter Pokemon could be found in more than one region on a frequent basis, relatively speaking, it is possible that one location could be favored as a point of acquisition over another, and this could in turn cause harm to the efforts behind breeding them elsewhere in order to help keep a steady supply present in the region. This sense of exclusivity also helps to make the starter Pokemon unique and defining attributes of a given region as well, acting sort of like mascots or icons in that sense, to act as a gateway for enticing trainers across the world to come and visit the region and start their journey there, or at the very least continue it from wherever they may have started. In addition to all of this level of exclusivity is also often derived from the fact that the region they are mainly found in likely has specific habitats that can help the populations flourish to at least some degree, and thus have the best chance of survival in the wild and in breeding camps there, which will be expanded upon in a bit. This in turn makes it a lot easier for these otherwise rare beasts to be supplied regularly to trainers in the region, regardless of how many are needed, and this helps to ensure that regional professors are able to provide whatever is needed for the job, though there are some limitations on what can be done with the population numbers. Constraints do exist on this attribute that should be noted as far as breeding and habitation goes, as their rarity is tied to not just the regional choice, but also the environmental circumstances of their existence.
However, on this note, it's important to state that, while most starter Pokemon are indeed native to the regions they occupy, not all were as such starting out and actually had to be brought in from different lands.
This can occur for a number of reasons, but down to the simplest point, it is usually a consequence of ideal candidates for a specific type, as discussed already, not being present or otherwise don't simply meet the requirements that would make them worth using as starter Pokemon. This is not an uncommon problem, and often sees the most issues with the fire and water types. The former tend to be isolated to volcanic environments or otherwise near geothermal hotspots, where the fiery existence can be easily linked and supported in these sorts of habitats. The latter, on the other hand, can be harder to locate suitable candidates for because of the specific types of waterways and aquatic environments that might be present in a given region, and them not being enough to support something that behaviorally matches up with what is needed. Grass types are usually much easier to handle in these cases, as long as the region has large, lush natural areas like grasslands, forests, and even jungles that can support a wide variety of grass-type life. As one might imagine, this can create some serious problems if a Pokemon cannot be located in these given environments that works best with the other qualifications required for starter Pokemon. In cases where these sorts of issues might arise, importation and adaptation is usually the easiest and best way to help alleviate the problem, and it has worked to such an extent that at least some native starter Pokemon in regions across the world are usually only native to other regions, but have now managed to adapt somewhat of a dual existence in the new habitats, enough to make them all but impossible to locate in the lands they may have once called home. The members of the Piplup family are an interesting example, as while it has been seen in ancient times that they have existed in the coastal waters of the Hisui and Sinnoh regions, they are not specifically designed biologically for that type of habitat, instead originally coming from frozen lands of the Arctic Ocean, where their cold-resistant bodies are more attuned to the natural environment. It is not entirely certain how they managed to make it into the Sinnoh region, but given the historical record, it is possible that they were brought in from explorers that came from these colder lands, and thus were imported by individuals that settled in the time of the Hisui region, and likely even further back in time. More examples can be found within the Sinnoh region itself as well, as we have documented cases of Pokemon from far-off lands being brought into the region for a time to act as research partners and fighters for those who sought to learn more about this region when it was the Hisui region, and in any way they could possibly muster. Sadly though, the latter case didn't pan out entirely, as none of those imported starters were able to build a lasting population in the region as it transitioned into the Sinnoh region. Though it is still interesting to note that the said starters of Rowlet, Cyndaquil, and Oshawott all gained unique regional variant forms in Hisui once fully evolved. Connected to all of this, while it might be easy to assume that breeding populations of starter Pokemon might at least be something that could be seen in the wild, this is sadly not the case most of the time, and it is as such for both practical and societal reasons. As with quite a few rare Pokemon, the capacity for starter Pokemon to successfully breed is stunted greatly as a consequence of their incredibly lopsided gender ratio, as most normal starter Pokemon tend to occur in populations with a ratio of 1 to 8 in favor of males, resulting in very few females being present in any environment from which more of their exact kind could come forth from. This has resulted in most breeding populations being taken into enclosed spaces and taken care of by artificial means, which has resulted in both positive and negative consequences for their existence. While hosting them in artificial or at least protected areas in the wild, professional breeders of starter Pokemon are able to make the most of the land to ensure that breeding populations form fast and strong with no serious weaknesses or threats, and by controlling population numbers, they can maintain the rarity for the purpose of teaching young trainers, while still keeping them at numbers that reflect a healthy population. However, doing it at all in this manner also restricts the capacity of these species to adapt to new environments and thus renders them vulnerable if some sort of change occurs in their breeding environment that might harm them. Still, this risk is usually worth taking, as it means that the environmental and social impact of their existence and survivability are controlled to maximum efficiency.
The third criteria to address here is that unlike some other Pokemon, starter Pokemon tend to be much easier to initially raise and get along with than some other species, and not just on an individual basis.
In reality, over time, they have been bred to maximize their friendliness towards humans and their willingness to obey them, a state of domestication mixed with raw wild instinct. This process has made it possible for these beasts to readily bond with their trainers in most instances, and even if they are known to potentially be a handful, they can at least be reasoned and directly interacted with absent of hostilities or extreme ferocity. Now, it is important to note that this does not always apply to their evolved forms, as evolution tends to let their more bestial instincts emerge with full bravado, but even then these evolved forms can potentially be controlled more effectively through the bonds they forge as children. This also does not mean that they are easy to initially befriend in all cases, as individuals are always going to have personalities that may or may not differ from the norm, but by and large they can be some of the easiest Pokémon to befriend, even if one is not always the best at taking care of them. On that note, however, this also does not mean that they are entirely safe to interact with in this fashion either, as many fire types have open flames on some part of their body and thus can be a hazard to others if they get too close, while others like Totodile have instincts that make them a danger even if they don't intend to be one, and thus can require specialized training to deal with. Thankfully, these minor issues rarely ever derail any desire to invest in these types of Pokémon as choices for starters, making their relative friendliness a standout and standard attribute of their identity.
Lastly, it cannot be ignored that, as mentioned briefly already, there is something to be said for the fact that, despite how rare these starter Pokémon typically are, they always seem to have some degree of availability with the Pokémon professors of a region, and in fact, they are almost always the sole source of them in their respective locales.
This begs the question as to why they seem to be the only ones entrusted with these rare creatures, and the answer dictates there are likely several factors at play. For one thing, as certified professors in their fields, it would make sense for them to have access to these rare species to best analyze their unique traits and determine if they are not just worthy of being designated as starter Pokémon, but in turn how they would perform in battle and whether or not they are on par with other candidates, since most starter Pokémon tend to share a similar base stat total and combat potential with one another. Moreover, almost all professors in their respective regions have access to the resources needed to keep a wide variety of Pokémon fed and well cared for, oftentimes as part of their own lab space, and could thus provide the supportive environment needed to ensure that these Pokémon will be fine until they meet the trainer they are destined to be with for the coming years. And, of course, it makes sense for them to be the sole distributors of these beasts, as they often have connections to breeders across the region they occupy in order to help ensure that a region's biodiversity, for the sake of science if anything else, is always preserved, helping to keep their respective regions and the rare beasts that live within them safe from harm as much as they possibly can.
While they might come in many different forms and ultimately can be hard to get a hold of if you aren't always born in the right location or able to travel, there is no doubt that starter Pokémon are an incredibly important commodity for trainers across the world for the power and unique abilities that make them stand out from a crowd.
Though the number of them might change depending on the region at hand, and even how they might interact with others, the standards that have been put in place to make them easy for all to work with in general nonetheless makes them vital for many that are ready to start their own Pokémon journey into the vast unknown. No matter which one you choose, always know these beasts are special for a reason, and to have any of them as part of a team is a privilege, both for you and for them, and having the chance to bond with someone that they may hopefully be with for life.
That wraps up this episode, so stay safe out there, hold your Pokémon close to you, and I'll see you all on the next episode of the V.T.P. Thank you all for watching this video. It always brings me great joy to see others enjoying the work I do to try and make the world of Pokémon and the fascinating creatures that lay inside of it feel as real as they possibly can. If you really enjoy my work, please feel free to leave a comment and subscribe, as I always do my best to respond to any and all comments that are left on my videos. In addition, if you wish to learn more about my work and help support it, you can find links to my Patreon page, as well as email and other contact information to my work on DeviantArt in the video description down below. Furthermore, you can find a link to my Discord server there as well if you'd like to get a first glimpse at what videos are coming up next and converse with other fans of the world of Pokémon. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and have a wonderful rest of your day.